For months, it felt like the world's two biggest economies, the US and the EU, were staring into the abyss of a full-blown trade war. This was a fight that could have wrecked global supply chains, vaporized jobs, and sent the entire global economy spinning into chaos. Then, with an August 1st deadline breathing down everyone's necks, a deal was struck. The European Union agreed to a 15% tariff ceiling on most of its goods heading to America. But don't mistake this for a simple surrender. This was a calculated, high-stakes political gamble to dodge something much, much worse. This wasn't just about money. It was about security, geopolitics, and a desperate bid to keep a critical alliance from completely falling apart. In this video, we're breaking down the high-stakes strategy behind the compromise that pulled Europe and the US back from the edge. The stakes, a war averted. So why would the EU agree to a deal that, let's be honest, looks like a major loss? To get it, you have to look at the alternative. The situation was escalating at a terrifying speed. The Trump administration wasn't just threatening tariffs, it was using them as a weapon. After hitting Europe with a universal 10% tariff back in April, the threats got more specific and a lot more severe. The administration made it clear, if there was no deal by August 1st, it would slam a blanket 30% tariff on all goods coming in from the EU. And let's be crystal clear, a 30% tariff wasn't a negotiating chip. It was an economic bomb. Some analysts were even modeling worst-case scenarios with tariffs hitting 50% or even higher, which would have been catastrophic. A move like that would have essentially flash-frozen huge parts of the transatlantic economy, an economic relationship that sees over 4.2 billion euros in trade crossing the Atlantic every single day. The damage would have been instant and everywhere, hitting everything from German cars to Irish pharmaceuticals and French wine. With the clock ticking, EU negotiators were scrambling. As one report put it, they were prepared to stomach an unbalanced agreement if it meant dodging a full-blown trade war. The choice wasn't between a good deal and a bad one. It was between a painful deal and an absolute catastrophe. The breakdown. What was agreed to? So what's actually in this painful deal? Well, it's not some detailed 1,000-page legal treaty. Think of it more as a broad political handshake, a framework designed to stop the bleeding. The headline item is the EU agreeing to a 15% tariff ceiling on the vast majority of its exports to the US. And to be clear, this isn't an extra 15%. It's an all-in cap. If a product already had a small tariff, the total now can't go over 15%. This 15% rate hits some of Europe's most important export sectors. The auto industry, a giant for countries like Germany and Italy, is now capped at 15% on both cars and parts. High-tech exports like pharmaceuticals and semiconductors also fall under this new tariff ceiling. But not everything gets off that easily. A few key sectors are left out of this compromise, and for them, the pain is much, much worse. The US is keeping its punishing 50% tariffs on European steel, aluminum, and copper. That's a massive wall for heavy industry. The only sliver of hope is a promise from both sides to talk about something called tariff rate quotas. In theory, this could let the EU export a certain amount of these metals at a lower rate, based on past numbers, before the 50% hammer comes down. But the details on that are fuzzy and still need to be worked out. In exchange for this tariff cap, the EU made some massive promises. It is committed to steering around $600 billion in investments into the United States over the course of President Trump's term. It also pledged to buy a staggering $750 billion in American energy products through 2028. To give you some scale, The EU's total energy imports from the US last year were only about $70 billion. Now, these are huge aspirational goals that rely on private companies to happen, but they were absolutely key to getting this handshake deal done. Figuring out these complex trade deals is key to understanding how global politics hits your wallet. If you got some value out of this breakdown, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. The strategy, a calculated defeat. This brings us to the big question. Why on earth did the EU sign a deal where it takes on new tariffs and promises to spend gigantic sums of money, while the US basically gives up nothing? The answer is a cold, hard dose of political reality. This was a strategic retreat, not a total surrender. First, Europe's negotiating leverage was incredibly limited. The Trump administration's aggressive and unpredictable style shredded decades of trade policy. The constant whiplash of tariff threats from 20% to 50%, then down to 10% before threatening 30%, that wasn't random. It was a deliberate tactic to keep EU negotiators completely off balance. Europe was facing an administration that sees trade as a zero-sum game, not a partnership. And Europe was negotiating from a weak spot, partly of its own making. Decades of lower defense spending left the continent heavily reliant on the US military umbrella. This deal was about more than just cars and cheese. It was a concession to keep America anchored in the transatlantic alliance. As one EU trade chief put it after the deal was signed, it wasn't just about trade. It was about security, Ukraine, and the shaky state of world politics. The EU decided to take an economic punch to avoid a geopolitical knockout, like the US pulling back from NATO or abandoning other shared security goals. Second, Brussels chose short-term stability over the chaos of a tariff war. An escalating fight with tariffs met by more tariffs would have unleashed total uncertainty for businesses. A 15% tariff hurts, but it's a number you can plan for. It gives businesses a predictable baseline to adjust their supply chains and adapt. EU leaders bet that this painful stability was better than the roller coaster of a trade war they were unlikely to win. They saw how other countries who fought back harder ended up facing even steeper penalties. One European Commission official called it a policy of strategic realism. The winners an amp, losers. So now that the dust is settling, let's break down the winners and losers. The most obvious losers are Europe's major export industries. German and Italian car makers, which ship hundreds of thousands of vehicles to the US every year, now face a major cost hike that will likely squeeze profits and hurt their competitiveness. This could mean billions in lost revenue and put thousands of European jobs at risk. The same goes for high-value sectors like pharmaceuticals and tech. This pain isn't spread out evenly either. Countries with big manufacturing industries that rely heavily on US exports, think Germany, Italy, Ireland, and Slovakia, are set to take the biggest economic hit. Some economists are projecting a modest but noticeable drag on the EU's overall GDP, possibly a dip somewhere between 0.2% and 0.8%. On the flip side, the Trump administration gets to claim a clear political win. It strong-armed one of the world's biggest economic powers into accepting tariffs and making huge spending promises, all without giving up much in return. That plays perfectly into a domestic story about rebalancing global trade for America's benefit. But what about the American consumer? That picture is a lot murkier. While the deal might shield some domestic jobs, tariffs on European goods will almost certainly mean higher prices for everything from cars to cheese. And it's not even a clear win for all American manufacturers. Many of them depend on specialized European parts and components, and those inputs just got more expensive. Maybe the biggest winner is just the idea of stability. For global markets and businesses on both sides of the Atlantic, this deal pulled the world back from a trade war that could have easily triggered a recession. It created a new, more expensive, but at least predictable reality for doing business across the Atlantic. This EU-US trade deal isn't just another agreement. It marks a fundamental shift in how the world does business. The long era of pushing for freer trade seems to be over, replaced by a new game of managed trade, strategic competition, and using economic muscle for political goals. Europe made a tough call. It swallowed short-term economic pain to prevent what it saw as a catastrophic breakdown of the Western alliance. This deal isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a new, bumpier chapter in the relationship. A lot of the specifics still need to be negotiated, from the fine print on metal quotas to whether Europe can even make good on its massive energy and investment promises. This was a compromise born from a position of weakness and a sense of necessity, a strategic choice to accept a less bad outcome to prevent a disaster. And it leaves a huge question hanging in the air. As the old rulebook for global trade gets torn up, was this a smart play to save a critical partnership? Or was it the first step down a very slippery slope of giving in? What do you think? Was this the right move for the EU? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.